Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us in the world, and welcome to today's webinar. We're so glad you took the time out today to actually join us. My name is Awais Chowdhury, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. Now, joining our discussion today, we have Amanda Alvarez and Jim Routh, who will both be sharing their insights and experience on the what and how of an effective AppSec program, how to frame the benefits for a C-level audience, and much, much more. So I can guarantee you're in for a real treat. Now, to provide a brief introduction on both of our guests, Amanda Alvarez is a seasoned application security leader with over a decade of experience in transforming software security programs at scale. Currently a senior technical account manager at Legit Security, Amanda partners with enterprise customers to help operationalize AppSec tools, strengthen their software supply chains, and embed security into every phase of development. Now, with a background spanning defense, healthcare, and large-scale DevSecOps transformations, they specialize in building collaborative, security-driven cultures that align with business goals. In addition, Amanda is also a co-lead for Let's Talk Software Security, a community that challenges the status quo and fosters inclusive conversations about modern security practices. Now, our second guest is Jim Routh, who is a former CSO or CISO for American Express, DTCC, KPMG, Aetna, CVS, and MassMutual. Jim also serves on the boards of Savvy Security, Accountable Digital Identity Association, and the Global Resiliency Federation. He's a former board chair for HISAC and a former board member for FSISAC. In addition, Jim is the Chief Trust Officer for Savint and brings a vast business and technology background to boards and senior executives, and is considered a digital and cybersecurity industry expert as well as thought leader. In addition, Jim is an advisor for Wiz, Netscope, Armis, Transmit Security,
don't bother. The list
and a
is too
whole
long.
host. Yeah, and a whole host, but of course, including Legit Security as well. And in addition, he also serves as an advisor in an advisory capacity for a number of investor kind of VC funds as well. Outside of that, though, Jim, there's more to you. You know, I know you're also a fellow with ICIT and an adjunct faculty member teaching at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering as well. So, before we get going, I just want to kind of mention to the audience, thank you for joining us again. If you have any questions during the session, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll definitely do our best to save time at the end for Q&A. Now, before we kick in, it's important to note that Jim is the author of a recent white paper titled "How to Build a Compelling Business Case for a Software Security Program," which is ultimately the backdrop for today's discussion. So, with that, Amanda and Jim, I'd like to welcome you both.
Thanks, Wes.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. So let's kick this off. Could you both start by just sharing some of your experience in terms of implementing software security programs?
Sure. I'll start if that's okay. I had a lot of experience, maybe 6 times of building a business case for a software security program. I call it software security because it's supposed to encompass all software rather than application security, which historically was focused on internal applications that were custom. But I think Gary McGraw and I are the only ones that call it software security. So think of software security as synonymous with app security. They're the same thing. And so building a program for software security in terms of a business case actually is really easy. Now, I say that because historically, if you look across enterprises, there are a lot of cybersecurity professionals that struggle with that they don't view it as easy. They view it as difficult. And we're going to talk about what you can do to make it easy and what you can do to remove the difficulty and the challenge that's there. And it's actually pretty straightforward. So I look forward to that.
Wonderful. Amanda?
Yes. So I have had experiences being involved in implementing software security programs. And I like the terminology of software security as well, because to your point, Jim, it does encompass more than just your internally built applications. You have your third parties, you have your internally developed apps, you have externally facing apps, you have commercial solutions that you're also building into your environment as well, right? That also includes, your build tools, your developer environments, your build environments, everything that is involved in the life cycle of building a product, really. So I am super excited to be part of this conversation because there's a lot of tips and tricks that we'll cover that will kind of help people walk away with actual tactical techniques on having conversations with the right people at the right time and figuring out what's going to work within the organization.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing as well. And let's start with a very kind of common considered barrier. And I'm sure, Jim, you've found it. I'm sure you've both found this as well in your past experiences. We often hear that there isn't enough funding for AppSec. From both of your perspectives, why can it be, or why is it so difficult to make a business case for such a program, for such an important program, and especially when we kind of differentiate it?
Yeah, historically, regulators in regulated industries haven't really focused on AppSec. So that's one problem. Auditors follow suit, and they haven't necessarily focused on that either. And to the degree that there is any kind of attention being paid to application security, it's mostly conventional controls that, frankly, today are a bit obsolete. The whole notion of taking code that's produced by an engineer and then putting it through some sort of laundry process that finds defects, then interpret the defects, which ones are valid and which ones aren't, then feed that back to the engineer and think that the engineer is going to fix all of that and do all of that and get the code into production on a timely basis. That model is totally obsolete and totally independent of a mature CI/CD pipeline today. And so a lot of the regulatory compliance orientation is towards controls that are obsolete and not at all in tune with the way software is assembled today. So that's one of the big, drawbacks. Frankly, I think going forward, we have to realize that software is assembled and it comes from multiple sources inside the company and outside the company. And that's not changing. That's the future and that's today. And so the control capability has to support that way and method of assembling software components. And then if you add the changes that large language models are having on how software is assembled and how software is tested for efficacy, everything is changing. And so we're in a period of dramatic change around the software development process, and yet our principal and primary controls are vested in the past and are obsolete. So that's a real dilemma that we have as practitioners, as cybersecurity practitioners. And there is a way of building a business case to get around that, but I'll wait and hold off until you ask me that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, you kind of highlighted, that the potential disconnect within that process as well, which is very evident. And of course, that's definitely one of the major kind of points that would need to be addressed as well. Amanda, from your perspective and experience as well, is there anything that you would kind of add to this as well from as a former practitioner?
Yes. So with that disconnect comes a cost, right? So the time to do a security test could impact the time to deliver value, right? So developers are measured in how quickly can they deliver so that the business is increasing in their revenue, they're increasing their reputation and their trust within the market space, right? A security test or a security control is usually a point in time, a blocker, a gate, and something that usually costs the business somewhere. And that typically creates friction in negotiating how do you get more budget for security teams. So when security is often seen as a cost or as an OpEx, right? While developers are generating value, you have to almost translate your perception of what security is bringing to the table. Yes, we're another expense, but we're going to cost a little bit more here. We're going to bring value over here as well, right? When you reframe the relationship of security to developments, we're not just another ancillary part of the business. We're actually part of that development workflow. We're embedding those feedback mechanisms in a way that's not just point in time compliance checks, but it's actually continuous, right? As a developer is writing code, show me the quality and the results of that, right? And something that Jim called out earlier is that we're not trying to flag them with all of these vulnerabilities, but just simply call them as defects, right? You have a flaw in the code somewhere that needs to be addressed. And the sooner you address it, the less costly it will be to remediate it later. And so when you start to, leverage that as a tool, funding becomes a little bit easier to make that justification for, right? An example I had was there was a security tool that we had within our SDLC that was very costly, both to implement, both to get adoption, both to get developers to actually take action on the findings. And it simply just wasn't the tool that we needed for a development team that was rapidly evolving in how they were building software. So we had to make the justification that if we coordinated and partnered with our engineering teams to secure the budget, we could demonstrate how much time everyone is saving if we all worked together and modified our feedback loops so that developers are not inundated and slowed down with their velocity.
Got it. No, thank you for sharing that. Now, I want to go back to Jim for this one as well, because I know, Jim, you're probably waiting for this question. So let's start at the beginning here. We have practitioners, they need to build a case for a software security program. What steps would you recommend?
Yes, step one is what not to do. And so what I'm going to ask you not to do is what everybody tries to do the first time they build a business case for a software security program, which is try to attach it to risk and say that the reason for the software security program and the additive expense, as Amanda was describing, is to reduce the risk for the enterprise. And this is absolutely the wrong approach, the wrong thing to do. And I know as cybersecurity professionals, that sounds like it's incongruent with what our principles are. So let me be very specific. There is no attribution to a software security defect for any enterprise, whether you're producing commercial software for consumption by an enterprise or software being used by individuals. There's no attribution. So what does that mean? Well, when I was a developer and I wrote shitty code, that shitty code was consumed by enterprises, let's say, and the enterprises says, well, this application stinks, and it doesn't function properly, or there's risks associated with that. But that was never attributed back to me, the author of the code in the first place. Probably should have been, probably should be, but it's not. In fact, most times when there's a fundamental software defect that creates a big problem for consumers or for enterprise customers, the attribution back to the source of the code and the enterprise that produced it is not in place. It's never done. Usually what happens is when there's a vulnerability that's exploited, the consumer and the victim finds out months after the fact, and they can't remember which site they were on necessarily, or what transactions they did, or what the root cause was, and they don't even think about that. They just try to make themselves whole as a victim of a cybersecurity crime. And so there is no attribution. And so don't play this card. Don't try to say the reason that we need to spend more money on building software securely is because we're managing the risk. Managing the risk becomes the byproduct. The reason we want to spend more money on software security is to lower the cost of producing software. And if you look, no matter what company you work for, at how much money your company is spending to develop and maintain software for supporting your business model, whatever business you're in, whatever enterprise that you're in, you'll realize that it's a lot of money. And so all you have to do is to say, whatever that amount of money is that's spent annually to develop and support software, if the cybersecurity organization reduces the cost to the enterprise of that, what it costs to build software and own and maintain that software, if we reduce that cost, then we can take some of the savings, a small percentage of the savings, and apply that to the spend or the investment that has to be made in the products and capabilities to support the development process. And so you're not asking for additive money. You're asking to save money. And in my case, I was in large enterprises. So we were in the billions of dollars a year spent on developing software to support all of the businesses, right? And so all I had to do is to say, hey, we'll save $10 million a year. And I tell you what, give me 5 of the savings to spend on the tooling necessary and the education, everything else to roll this out. In the meantime, you're going to collect $5 million of saves on top of in terms of our operating budget. And the CFO was thrilled. The CIO was ecstatic. The CEO said, "Can you do more?" And the reality is, yeah, that was a pretty conservative number. And so it's actually very easy to get money for a software security program. You just have to ignore risk. And I know that sounds countercultural to a cybersecurity professional, but ignore it because it's not part of the business case. The business case is to save money and literally to reduce operating costs, and specifically the total cost of IT ownership. And part of the savings from that get invested or reinvested, if you will, into the upfront costs to provide the tools and capabilities to support that. But it's actually relatively small compared to the gain that can be had for almost any business.
Yeah. No, and thank you for sharing it. And it's really interesting, but the first point that you made is that as high level as it sounds, it seems like there's quite a shift in mindset as well that's required from the get-go, so that you're not, I guess, pulled in the direction of how as we typically do within the cybersecurity space in terms of focusing on that risk and kind of leading with that risk as well. But that mindset shift is obviously a very important piece of this. How have you kind of managed that process? So that's an additional, this is something that kind of came to mind. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that as a former from the CISO. How do you kind of direct your teams in that capacity?
Yeah, so there's a magic word in a software security program, and it's called accountability. And so the question is, who's accountable for producing quality? And I would argue that yesterday, the person accountable for producing quality of software is the software engineer. And that was true yesterday. I believe it's true today. And I believe it will always be true tomorrow. The accountability for producing high quality software is in the hands of the creator. So whoever's owning the process, they're the owner of quality. Now, within quality, there's something called resilience, which means is the software subject to a hacker to perform a criminal action, and compromise data, because that's a lack of quality if that's the case, the defect. And Amanda said this earlier. We know how to deal with software defects. There's never been code written that didn't have some defects at some level. All software has defects. Some of it is in the code, some of it is in the design, but these are flaws, these are defects. And essentially, cybersecurity resilience is a subset of the defects in code. And so if we can produce software with fewer defects, it costs less to operate that software. It's just intuitive. It's easy to understand. And so that's the reason for spending time and effort and energy on a software security program. It's to lower operating costs or the total cost of IT ownership. And it turns out that every stakeholder in an enterprise can get behind that. including the people that are producing the software. And so accountability is really important, because sometimes the accountability model gets bastardized to where the product security team owns responsibility for the resilience of this software. And that's not the right model, because they don't produce the software. They might identify the tools that can help identify defects early in the process, all good. But that's not being, they're not accountable for the end product and the quality of the end product. The accountability, if I was producing a machine learning algorithm, I'm a data scientist, I'm accountable for it. If I'm producing an LLM, I'm accountable for that LLM. If I'm producing software, I'm accountable for it. If I'm using an LLM to produce the software, I'm accountable for resilience of the output. If I'm using LLM to test the efficacy of the software that I'm writing, I'm accountable. The accountability enforcement is absolutely essential to the success of any software security program.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing. Amanda, I just want to kind of ask you as well, in terms of if there's anything that you could add as well to what Jim shared in relation to the steps that Jim shared as well. So for starting or building a case for that program as well, anything that you would kind of like to add on, piggyback on to add to what Jim shared.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two things to recognize here. One, when developers are building software, they're genuinely having a lot of fun on solving for hard problems, getting their hands involved with something that they can tangibly build and see the outputs of that. When security kind of comes in and says, these are all the things thou must do, right? It kind of creates this negative perception that we're not their allies. We're just here to tell them that there's more work to be done, rather than partnering with them on enabling them to understand, hey, you are accountable for the software you wrote. You wrote it, you fix it, right? Or if you broke it, you fix it. And then secondly is understanding that they also have their own requirements and deadlines to get done, right? So if we're introducing all of these security tests and tools and defects that need to be remediated at some point, you need to learn to negotiate with not just developers, but the developers' leadership, right? Developers at the end of the day are not the ones ultimately responsible for deciding what gets built. They're just the ones who's responsible for getting that work done. So you have to work with multiple levels of people in understanding that there's a total cost of ownership here to build software. The more people that get involved, the more time it sometimes takes for software to actually meet the end of its life cycle as it continues to evolve over time. So maintaining those relationships, building those networks, and finding your allies on what good software could look like. Most importantly, reframing the perception of it's not a security vulnerability, it's not a security issue, it's a defect, right? Reframe that conversation, and now you're speaking the same language, right? These are the security requirements. Here's how you need to get those done. If you need any help, you know where to find me, right? And that creates an element of partnership, right? Where I find security programs to be successful when the development teams actually reach out to the security teams and say, hey, I have this thing going on. I need your security expertise to help me figure out what I need to do here, right? And by building those relationships, you're shifting the narrative from, security has to do that, I have to do this, and it shapes it together as a team effort, right? And accountability really goes a long way. So if developers understand that they're accountable for writing quality software, they'll actually look to figure out what do they need to do to actually achieve that goal of meeting a certain level of resiliency so that they continue having more programs to work on, right? If the product is too faulty, if there's too many flaws, if it breaks the element of trust to the end user, well, there may be some impact down the line that actually reduces the number of projects that they get to work on. Right. So it's kind of like a help me, help you, help everyone situation when you help them understand why they need to remediate their issues that are being presented to them, and also giving them the tools to enable them to do it. Right. Time is also a sensitive topic. Right. So not only is it costly to buy tools, implement them, train people on how to do it, when do you find the time to do it? It's incremental. Right. You're not going to build a software security program overnight. These things take months to years to building something within just one business unit, right? And then you do it all over again in the next business unit. And then, oops, a merger and acquisition just rolled up. We got to go through that all over again too, right? So you have to figure out what's a model that works for one team and then apply it to several different teams and how they operate. And then again, hold everyone accountable while supporting them to achieve those goals.
There we go. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing both. And I do actually want to go a little bit deeper into the defect, around defects as well. But before asking that, I wanted to ask you and kind of get your thoughts on, as we think about application security, what is the relationship to code quality? How do these two themes, relate to each other, overlap? If you could both kind of share some thoughts around that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think code quality and application security do share a lot of similarities. I almost wish the industry kind of moved away from application security itself as well, because it creates this like isolated bubble that it's a different thing that a different team has to take care of, right? Some external team has to tell my team that I have flaws and issues. Well, that's an environment that we've inherently created in today's ecosystems of things. But when you reframe things to code quality, resiliency, and having a method to align to the standards of what quality means, right? That probably just means you need to update your definition of done, your success criteria on how you achieve those goals, and configuring tools in such a way that gives developers the feedback mechanisms that they are ready for, right? Change is hard. If I've learned anything from the pandemic, is that change is constant all the time. And that sometimes it catches people by surprise, but you need to have a structure and culture in place where you're embracing that change. And by embracing change and working with your developers on incremental modifications to their software development lifecycle, if you bring in a new tool and say, we're just going to alert you on what your potential flaws are, right? Let's look at the quality of the data from the output of our scanners and say, do we trust this enough to start implementing enforcement gates so that we trust and then verify that we're doing our due diligence and meeting our definition of done that we've previously negotiated on, right? So there's a lot of partnership in translating security requirements to non-functional requirements where scanners and quality scans are running in the background, and then functional requirements that come out of design reviews and threat models, right? So there's multiple layers of defense controls that you can implement. And it's just a matter of reframing the language and using the systems that already exist today. So one of my favorite techniques whenever I work with anyone is, how do your developers work? Are they agile? Are they waterfall? Do they use a scaled agile framework where they meet periodically to get with all the stakeholders? And then from there, you can figure out, okay, what's one requirement you can introduce? SAST and SCA scanners, for example, is a good starting point of introducing, hey, we're going to run some scans. They're different from your traditional ones, but here's what the outputs could look like. And then let's work together on figuring out what's a healthy way to address that technical debt. Again, that's a terminology that development teams are already accustomed to. They're already being held accountable to managing a certain threshold of technical debt, right? Do you fix it now? Do you fix it later? What's the total cost of ownership of deciding to fix it later? And having those conversations early and often really drives the needle on getting people to adopt practices within a software security program.
Appreciate it. Jim, anything from your experience that you could share as well in terms of how those two kind of themes relate and what you can share there?
Yeah, I certainly support everything that Amanda said, and she used a word that is actually essential here. She used time. See, that's what we use as a measure for software development in any enterprise, large or small. Time. How much time does it take? And of course, all software developers try to reduce the amount of time that it takes to create a quality product that supports a business need. And the enterprise is, interested in that outcome as well. And different technology choices have different implications of time. Some, if it's a new technology to the team of developers that are going through the development cycle, well, there's some additive time that has to be applied to learn the technology and master that technology over time. And so time is the most essential part of the software development process, and it's how we measure this across the board. And so that's the tool that the cybersecurity team can use as the baseline for saying, well, if we reduce time that it takes to develop, maintain software, then we have a savings of time. And we can reallocate that savings to doing additive activities that Amanda described of additional tests to find defects. And if we find and fix the defects during the development process, let's just say hypothetically that it cost for fixing defects, a total of all of the defects, we'll just pick a number and say cost 1,000 hours to fix those defects. Now, if we didn't fix those defects in the development process and we waited until the system was in production, that 1,000 hours would be 10 times that cost. So it's the same developer time and increment, but it's 10 times more because it's harder to fix things when a system's in production than when the system's being built in design and development. And so if we can move the cycle of identifying defects earlier, giving the tools to the developers in time to change in the software to incorporate the feedback and remove the defects, then we're saving money versus waiting until it's in production and then fixing it then. It's kind of like an automobile manufacturing line. When a car goes through the manufacturing process, it's on an assembly line and the components are added and the chassis and the engine and then the body parts are all added and many of them assembled robotically. Well, if at the end of that cycle, the car rolls off the assembly line and has a dent in the front side passenger door, there's two ways to handle that problem, that defect, if you will. One is to say, let's bang out the dent, rebuff it, maybe repaint it if it's necessary. So we have to take it off the assembly line. We have to add some engineers, essentially, to go through that process, and then release it to the car dealer. So we're adding cost to fix that defect. And if 1% of the cars are rolling off with that defect, then we're adding cost 1% of the time to fix that defect. Now, there's an alternative approach that says, well, why don't we find the root cause for that defect, the dent in the door, and adjust the robotics in the door assembly to avoid that defect. And then the car rolls off the assembly line and there are no defects and there's no additive cost. Now, there is some cost to identifying the defect and changing the robotics, but that cost is 1/10 of the cost that it costs to bang it out and repaint it or finish it and send it off to the dealers late. And so the same thing for software. There's lots of opportunity to move the defect identification and remediation activity earlier in the life cycle during assembly of the code. And ultimately, that's a lower cost than saving it for the end. So there's savings associated with that. Now, at the end of the day, there's some tools and capabilities to help that process move forward. And those tools and capabilities are evolving with new technology, and there's a lot of choices that can be made. But if the enterprise just keeps focus on reducing the cost of fixing defects by moving it early in the life cycle, good things happen economically in the time that's measured to produce the software. And that's in the interest of the software developer, of the manager of the development process, of the CIO, and the cybersecurity champion and the CISO. It's in everybody's best interest. And the economic outcome is positive, and the byproduct is more resilient software. And more resilient software means a lower risk profile or probability. And so that's why I say that a byproduct of this is better security, but it's not the objective. The objective is to lower costs because everyone can understand the value proposition of lowering the cost of ownership of IT.
Yeah. You've kind of done a full circle to actually reinforce that as well, lowering the cost as well, which is very, very important. Amanda, is there anything that you could like to kind of add to what Jim has mentioned in regard to that measuring measuring the defect density for a given system?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to give an understanding of why it matters to have quality software, right? And to Jim's point, it's not to directly reduce risk, it's to improve the resiliency, right? By improving resiliency, you're building better brand, you're building a better product, you're building that trust within the market that you're actually being very intentional with what you're putting out there, right? And at the end of the day, developers really do want to build quality software. They don't want to be known as the person that caused a bug on a Saturday afternoon, causing incidents that, requires everyone to be on hands to remediate those things, right? So I think there's a perception of what developers actually want to get done at the end of the day, which is why it's really important on understanding the value that comes with building programs that are sustainable, they're incremental, they're partnering with your development teams, their leadership, and ultimately the business at the end of the day, right? Like, for example, when I was working in healthcare, it really mattered a lot to me that we were preserving our systems. Things were accessible to the customers of our products and systems that required them. And understanding that why helped me translate to the actual developers and honestly to the QA teams as well, that we're all in this together. We're not here to just call out more issues, but we're here to build more quality software. And it builds that better together story, right? It actually enabled us to find overlapping tools. We were able to negotiate on what are the policies we needed, what can we check for now, what can we save for later? And it built that element of trust that we weren't here to slow them down, but actually enable them to build quality software. And the quality of software is encompassing of, security, resilience, accessibility, all those things that when a developer is building software may not be necessarily front of minds, but you can have the tooling in place that gives them gentle reminders that, hey, maybe you're going out of bounds, or maybe you might want to reconsider bringing in that open source library that could bring in potential risk. So there's a lot of potentials and lots of possibilities of risk, but when you talk about it from total cost of ownership, hey, you don't have any software issues with your libraries, but you do have some updates for them. Might as well get through them now if you have the time to do so, because it's going to save you time later on from having to rebuild the whole application around the upgrades needed, right? So keeping your code maintained up to date regularly kind of reinforces the idea that software is always incremental. It's always going to evolve. It's always going to change. And so with those changes comes potential threats that you need to kind of be cognizant of, but it doesn't need to be a showstopper, right? It doesn't need to be the star of conversations. It's just another line item that needs to be part of the developer's backlog. And then the system kind of becomes self-running, right? Because when you have a program where it's a culture of building quality software and not inundating people with the fact that security has to come first, it's much easier to get people to buy into adopting tools, attending lunch and learns, and actually outreaching for support when they need it, right? So when people are on board with feeling that support and feeling like they can trust their security advisors on how to go about a security problem, it doesn't feel like an uphill battle. And in fact, it's like a huge partnership and a win when everyone is working together to build quality software.
Jim and Amanda,
thanks.
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Wait, so I was just going to add that you had the screen up that shows defect density. And defect density is a really good metric or measure to use across development teams. Now, the reality is that different technologies are going to have different types of maturity in terms of the defect density, but it's a universal way of saying you have a defect and it's per output, which is line of code, and you look at the ratio between those two things, and it can translate across technologies, across different development teams, and you can measure the effectiveness of one development team compared to another. And an example, I was at a little bank called JP Morgan Chase running the global software security program. This is many, many years ago. And at the time, developers were not really in tune with software security. They didn't view it as part of their mandate, really. And so we implemented the defect density metrics, and it gave them something that was very easy to measure in terms of output and very easy to improve once they had the measurements. And they actually would take it upon themselves to take pride in the result in terms of the defect density score over time. And that score attributed directly to the economic value proposition that we mentioned earlier of less time and more time earlier in the life cycle that caused a benefit. And so I think we had 17,500 developers where we rolled out defect density across all of the technology platforms. And it was the key performance indicator that gave us not only the economic value, but also the security resilience measurement for every single development team, and really was useful in driving the needle forward.
Jim, you mentioned a good KPI for folks to take a look at. What about measuring the developer experience when it comes to building software? Do you think that there's like a way to measure how satisfied developers are in building code that you can then translate back to your tooling and the efficacy of your programs to figure out where you need to make improvements?
I think hypothetically that's brilliant. And if I was running a software security program today, I would attempt to do that. I can tell you with certainty that I never attempted to do that because frankly, I was just trying to get to square one and getting people to recognize the needs for security in the developer world. But I would tell you, Amanda, today, it's quite obvious to me that software developers understand security today. 15 years ago, not so much. Today, they understand it. Why? Well, they're all digital consumers, and they're all exposed to cybersecurity implications in the digital services that they consume. So they're much more attuned with that. So, 15 years ago, you had to convince the developer that, hey, we got to do this out of this stuff because, it's software security. And they're like, why do that? And today, they're like, yeah, just tell me what I can do. Give me the tools, give me the capabilities. I get it. I understand it. I don't need security awareness. I need tools and capabilities to help drive this and be more resilient and accountable for that resilience going forward. So it's very different dynamic. But to your point, I think the quality of the experience is, as an engineer in a software development process that's focused on fixing defects early in the life cycle, is got to be much better than a comparative sample of fixing defects post life cycle. So I would definitely try to measure that today. Unfortunately, I never did in past lives.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing both. And just before I ask my next question, I just want to send a quick reminder to the attendees. If you have any questions at all, anything that kind of pops up in the mind, feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll definitely have some time at the end to address those as well with both Jim and Amanda. Now, I know, Jim, you mentioned about cost of ownership as well. From your experience, what's the best way to measure the total cost of software ownership?
Yeah, well, some of this information can come directly from the balance sheet. So, for example, if we hire software developers as employees, that's right on the balance sheet. That's pretty easy to identify. If we hire software developers as contractors, that's pretty easy to identify as well. So essentially the baseline costs for people and talent, it's pretty straightforward. Where there's nuance is that if I'm a software developer working on project A, and project A is delivered 2 weeks early, that's a good thing. Costs less money to produce project A than what was originally forecasted. And now I have 2 weeks that I can add to another project, to something else. The measurement of the application of the time to another project is not captured. There is time reporting that you can try to get at that in the time reporting systems that may or may not be in place across the enterprise, and that's one source. But essentially, that's where it becomes a little bit tricky in terms of capturing the actual saves, because a couple of things happen. One is maybe the software developer who's no longer needed to produce the code, maybe they put a little bit more time into doing some kind of QA process on the project because they don't have another project to roll off on so they spend their time that. Well, that's still dollars being associated to this project, and so the enterprise has to have a level of discipline to be able to say, this hour for this project for that person was booked, on that project, and this hour, a different hour, was booked on a different project. And to capture the savings, it has to be on the different project, and it has to be, the reallocated time has to be captured that way. So it's more of an accounting and time reporting challenge than anything else. But you have to have some sort of mechanism from a time reporting standpoint to be able to show the difference. And again, the challenge is that often a developer will finish their work, but they'll ride out the project, not being assigned to another project, just kind of standing by in case there's need. And more efficient utilization would say move them to another project, because then we can take their time allocated to actual development on another project and get a gain from that. So that most of the cost variables are readily available in the balance sheet. The difference is really, like, for example, if a contractor works on a project and is done, usually they're rolled off right away. And so that savings associated with a 2-week that we were talking about earlier, that's easy to attribute. If it's an employee, they have to roll on to another project that may or may not be captured, accurately. So it's a little bit harder there to do that. But essentially, all the ingredients for the total risk of IT ownership can be identified because it's measuring time. And if fixing the defect and responding to incidents as a result of the defects, that all gets added into the total cost of IT ownership. So it's not just development, it's development, it's actually the support, fixing of defects, and then ultimately the vulnerability management, in case there has to be upgrades or changes to the operating system, those are all vulnerability management kinds of issues. So the total life cycle includes software development, software support, which may include vulnerability management and configuration management, and the total cost of IT ownership.
Let's also not forget the time to measure compliance, right? How much time are we spent in meetings trying to collect attestations that all the things that we've asked development teams to do have actually been done, right? And that kind of goes back to Jim's very initial points in that compliance and control checks are point in time and static, right? They're sometimes annually or quarterly or multiple times within a year, but they cost a lot of time from various different teams and participants to get involved and actually prove that the work was done that was requested of them. And so again, when people are looking for techniques on how do you actually get the buy-in for either more tools or more changes to a software security program, think about all of the different activities where time is being invested in activities that tools and solutions can save more time if we implemented more automation or modern technologies that will take away the manual efforts and give us more time to either focus on hunting down other systemic security initiatives or allowing developers to build cool software, right? So there's lots of areas where time and costs can be measured, and it's using that formula to find areas where improvements can be made. Again, it's very incremental, and understanding that delivering business value comes first, and how does security enable them to achieve that without slowing things down?
Thank you for sharing. So, obviously we've covered a lot here, in terms of the time, the cost, or reducing the cost, what not to do when trying to build a business case, what to do in those from a step-by-step perspective. But I want to, for both of you, I want to go the opposite way now as well. So, do you both have any examples from from previous experiences of software security programs that have, in some cases, failed to meet some of those business case requirements? If so, how did you overcome them?
What do you mean failed to meet the business case requirements? You
So
mean the actual functional requirements?
the functional requirements, yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not
Yeah.
prepared to answer that question because I hadn't thought about that before. So what you're saying is that, there's a set of functional requirements. We produce software output, but that software fell short of the functional requirements. And what did we do to measure that? Is that what your question
How
is?
did you, I would say, how did you overcome that? I actually trying to look at it from the perspective of how did you kind of address that and kind of overcome any sort of barrier that would come in that way?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that, so I'm going to defer to Amanda. Maybe you do.
Yeah, so I do actually have an example of this where it was probably very early on in my career for kind of building a software security program where I introduced a new change that needed to be adopted in the middle of a sprint. And I was very quickly informed that that is not the way the business runs. That's not the way they operate. They already made all their plans and commitments and promises to key stakeholders. And they said, Amanda, we cannot meet your security requirements today. What we can do is we'll acknowledge the risk that we're imposing and we will address it immediately after. So again, it was a simple conversation of, hey, we didn't get in front of you soon enough. Therefore, the business is going to continue as usual. We're going to document the risk and then we're going to address it as soon as possible. Understanding that there was a change needed in how I was communicating the functional requirements that needed to be implemented into the product, right? So sometimes it's a matter of, oops, I didn't get in front of you ahead of time, and that's okay. Some challenges I've seen with some software security programs is that it's difficult for people to admit when they made a mistake or that they did something wrong. But that's okay. We're all learning here, right? There's no such thing as perfect code. There's no such thing as a perfect software security program, right? We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to learn from each other. So it's important to acknowledge that at the end of the day, we're all colleagues, we're all friends here, hopefully. And, having that mindset of understanding that life happens, it's not the end of the world. If it was like, lives were on the line, that's a different story. But it was a matter of, hey, we can deal with it another time, business as usual for now, right? So having that level of understanding really goes a long way. And it's totally okay for the owners of that risk to say, yep, we know it's a thing, we'll get to it later, but you can only do as much as you can do in the software security team as the practitioner with the lens of, here's what could go wrong if we don't deal with it today. Here's the cost of fixing it later. If you're okay with that, then go ahead and move forward, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not the ones building the software. All we could do is just provide insights and guidances and modern practices on what to do and what not to do.
Yeah. Got it. So we have, I know we're just over 5 minutes from time. We have had a couple of questions that have come in. So obviously, again, this is going to be open to both of you as well. The first question is, how many software security staff members are necessary for an effective program?
Yeah, and the answer to that is that there's a baseline set of data in BSIMM, BSIMM. And if you go to, I think this website's still active today. If you go to bsim.com, you'll find data sets from maybe 120 companies or enterprises that have shared data on how many software security staff they have per number of developers. And the ratio, if I remember correctly, is somewhere like 1 to 4, 1 to 5 is kind of so for every 4 or 5 developers, you might have one person, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, I can tell you that I used to have 2 software security support resources. Maybe I had 4, I guess 4 for 17,000 developers. And that's really, really lean. But the only way that's possible is to have a champions program where you identify software security engineer or software engineers that wish to learn the techniques and the tool usage for reducing defects, and then coach other developers that they work on projects on how to use this capability. And so there's less dependence on a centralized software security team. And that's a better model. So if you have a champions program in place, or you design and implement one, the number of software security staff that you need goes down significantly. But anyway, what 120 companies did, the actual data points across a number of activities, but this being one of them, are available in the BSIM data. You can use that as a baseline. You can even break it out by industry if you want. This is what financial services, healthcare, other sectors, what they experience. And then you can make decisions on how many software security staff to have on your team to support it. One of the variables is if you've got a wealth of software security capability in place, then you can have minimal staff. If you don't have a lot of software security capability in place and you're implementing that, then you can have more staff that are necessary for the support in terms of the implementation. And that's usually measured in a year to 18 months timeframe, depending on how big the organization is. So that's what I recommend.
Plus one to everything that Jim just said. I would also add that in times of building very lean and flexible software security groups or teams, have some engineers on your team, right? To Jim's point, if the program is self-sufficient and self-sustaining and it's easy to adopt and embed security practices into the SDLC, you really don't need that many dedicated personnel to actually support the program at the end of the day. At the start, maybe you need a lot more just to kind of go through the initial phases of change and adoption and kind of educating everyone. Educating is probably the most costliest component of a software security program, because you have to teach people, here's what you were doing, here's what we want everyone to do, here's how you do it, here's why you do it, and then so forth. And then it becomes almost organic in that way, right? You're going to find your champions and your allies who want to build secure software, and then it grows from there. So it's a matter of kind of like finding your people, building your champions, add some engineers to your team, and make it as self-sufficient as possible.
Got it. Now with 1 minute left, I would like to kind of ask you quick, in one sentence, is if there was anything that you have to kind of like last final conclusion thoughts, what would that be? Let's see if we can do that in like 1 or 2 sentences from each.
Focus on the economics. If you focus on the economics, you're going to have positive results that are well received by all your stakeholders. It doesn't make the journey easier. It just makes getting the resource requirements that you need easier.
I'll say that sentence 1. Sentence 2 for me would be empathetic, right? Developers and the business are part of your program. So understand that where they're coming from, where their needs are, and how you can help empower them to do what they need to get done.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. So that's all obviously we have time for today. Amanda and Jim, thank you very much for joining this discussion. And also a big thank you to you, our audience. We will be sending an email with the recording of this session in the next couple of hours. If you have enjoyed today's webinar and want more information or have any unanswered questions, or if you actually want access to this white paper, which has been authored by Jim, firstly, feel free to visit icitech.org for that white paper. And if you have any additional questions, or if you'd like a demo, or just like to speak to Amanda or anyone else from the Legit team, please contact us at info@legitsecurity.com. With that, thank you once again to all, and have a great rest of the day.